Our inquiry question today is, what was the position of women in Britain in 1890? So first of all, I'd like to think about how it would be different to be a woman in 1890. Firstly, what do you think the main differences would be? And secondly, which of these differences do you think would be the most significant and why? Pause the video and consider both questions. So life for women in 1890 was very different to how it is today. In general, women in Victorian Britain were considered second-class citizens, not the equals of men. Their role was simply to be a wife and a mother, and occasionally a secondary wage earner, but on a lot less money than their husbands. They had to obey their husband in all they did, and they only had access to very, very limited education, and perhaps most significantly, they had no right to vote. Now, it wasn't exactly the same for all women. There was generally the same view that they were second-class citizens and they should not be treated the same as men. However, class was important to how your life was as a woman in 1890 Britain. There are three main classes in society at this time. There is the working class, where their husbands worked in manual labour, working in factories, in mines or in farming. The middle class, where people were professionals with an education, and the upper class, the very rich and wealthy. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, we'll treat the middle class and upper class as the same, because they had very similar attitudes towards the women. So, what was it like to be a working class woman? Before 1870, they would have had no education at all. In 1880, compulsory education for all between the age of 5 to 10 was introduced, and this in many ways had a remarkable impact. By 1900, 97% of all children could read and write, which have had a big impact on women who before this would not have had an education. However, girls followed a different syllabus to boys, and the things they read and wrote about was all about work in the home. Most working class women, when they left school, when they grew up, would also have to work. Jobs like domestic servant, they'd mostly do jobs like domestic servant, sewing, matchmaking, candle making, or working in a textile factory. However, by the end of the 19th century, there were some new jobs, such as typing and working on telephone switchboards, which were better paid. But women were still paid a lot less than men, and in many industries, women were expected to leave their jobs when they got married. So what was it like to be a middle or an upper class woman? Now, richer families educated their children at home, but it was still mostly focused on being good wives and mothers. They were taught things like music, sewing and drawing, things that would make them more agreeable companions to their husbands, and in many ways they were considered to be ornaments for men. There was a lot of social pressure to be thin and to fit into clothes with very tight waists to please the men. However, as time goes on, more and more started going to a school and receiving a better education. They started to see new education and employment opportunities, such as teaching, nursing and clerical work. And there are things like Oxford and Cambridge both introduced women's colleges, but women were still not allowed to get degrees. Some women started to become doctors. And by 1900, they could become doctors and architects, but many professions, such as being a lawyer, were still closed to them. And just like the working class women, they would still always be paid less than men. The other major area to look at was marriage. So the impact of marriage on women in 1890 was very different to what it would be today. Women were considered the property of their husbands, and in fact everything the woman owned became owned by the husband when they were married. It was also almost impossible for them to get a divorce. Husbands could rape and batter their wives, and women could not ask for a divorce. However, by 1900 there started to be some improvements. Women could divorce their husbands for cruelty, desertion and bigamy, which means having more than one wife. They could keep their own property after they were married, and they could no longer be forced to stay in the home, if the husband tried to. However, crucially, women still had far less rights than men. For example, husbands could divorce their wives for adultery, but wives could not do the same back to their husband. And if they did get a divorce, a woman would lose all her rights over her children. So, in summary, women were considered second-class citizens in Victorian Britain. They were mostly trained to be wives and mothers, and although they were receiving an education, it was focused on these areas. Working-class women did work, but in low-paid manual jobs where they were paid less than men. Middle and upper-class women didn't usually work, but were starting to get access to better education and employment, and were starting to get good careers. Women were the property of their husband, who could treat them very badly, and there was very little that women could do about it. However, they were starting to get some improvements in their rights by 1900. So please make sure you have completed the whole of your worksheet and rewind and watch bits again if there's bits you missed or did not understand. Thank you very much. Flip Your History is available in several different places. Through email and YouTube on flipyourhistory@gmail.com, on Twitter @flipyourhistory, and TS Resources Flip Your History. Feel free to contact me for further information, advice or guidance. Thank you.